At its zenith, the Soviet Union and the nations under the Warsaw Pact were one of the wealthiest, largest alliances the world had ever seen. But unfortunately, that didn't last long. The USSR crumbled no more than 69 years after it began, and left many new countries independent and implementing democratic rule after the fall of this vast communist union.
This became one of the most influential events of the 20th century, as from 1985 to 1991, at the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union disintegrated. This was caused by Mikhail Gorbachev's failing reforms and people in satellite states revolting, creating a turning point in history that altered global geopolitics to this day. Due to this action, many new republics were formed, and with that, new alliances and enemies arose, leading to Russia becoming a potential ally of the West. A new democracy was formed. However, due to corruption, low involvement by NATO, and a weak central government, a dictatorship with Vladimir Putin has risen, resulting in conflicts around the globe. By 1964, the Cold War was in full swing, and tensions between the Soviet Union and the US were high. In August 1961, the Berlin Wall had just been constructed, the Iron Curtain across Europe was in place, and the Cuban Missile Crisis had just occurred. After Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, was forced out of power in 1964, he was replaced by Leonid Brezhnev as first secretary and Alexei Kosygin as premier. During the period that Brezhnev held office, from 1964 to 1982, relations between the West and the Soviet Union started to improve with détente, or the ceasing of hostilities. Richard Nixon, who was president of the US at the time, visited Moscow, becoming the first to do so. Brezhnev later visited us in 1973. Treaties such as the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, also known as SALT, were signed in 1972, and both countries started to spend less on the arms race. However, since a large part of the Soviet budget was heading towards the space and arms race, and less towards the Soviet people, the Soviet economy started to stagnate. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Bloc, attempts at reform and revolution failed, most notably the Prague Spring and the Polish Crisis. These were put down brutally under the Brezhnev Doctrine, which stated that any threat to socialist rule in any state was a threat to them all, therefore garnering the military action of fellow bloc states and even the Soviet Union. Life in the Soviet Union was bad.
Life was hard. It always was hard in Russia and in this huge empire, Soviet Union, you know. And but there were also some good things. For example, we had free education, free medicine. Everybody had to work. It was no unemployment, no homeless people.
After the death of Brezhnev in 1982, he was succeeded by Yuri Andropov, who died in 1984. Afterwards, he was replaced by Konstantin Chernenko, who later died, and was finally replaced by Mikhail Gorbachev. One of the first things Gorbachev did was create new reforms to the Soviet Union to prevent its collapse, called glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, or restructuring. Glasnost allowed freedoms to the Soviet people. They could have the freedom of speech, writing, travel, and demonstrations. At the same time, perestroika introduced a limited system of capitalism into the Soviet economy. However, people had mixed feelings about these reforms.
Oh, it was nice that finally you can tell something openly and not worry that you're not supposed to say this. This is about glasnost. About perestroika, as I said, when everything is changing and everything is falling apart, and you are waiting that it will get better, but it was getting only worse. And when you think that it is as bad as it could be, and next month it was becoming even worse.
Perestroika brought chaos to the Soviet economy and destabilized it. Meanwhile, tensions between the US and the Soviet Union were increasing due to President Ronald Reagan, who held a tough stance on the Soviet Union. In his famous speech, Tear Down This Wall, he said, "In the 1950s, Khrushchev predicted, 'We will bury you.' But in the West today, we see a free world that has achieved a level of prosperity and well-being unprecedented in all human history. In the communist world, we see failure, technological backwardness, declining standards of health, and even want of the most basic kind, too little food." People in Eastern Bloc states wondered if glasnost meant they can reform their governments. When Gorbachev was asked if the Soviet Union would interfere if they tried to reform their governments, Gorbachev stated that he disagreed with reforms, but he wouldn't send Soviet troops to stop them. In response, Eastern Bloc nations started to leave Soviet control, with many having a peaceful transition to democracy, such as Poland, and in some cases a violent revolution, with Romania. The biggest of these actions was the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, resulting in German reunification. By 1990, control of the Eastern Bloc was no longer in Soviet hands. Reagan's stance started to lighten, and a positive relationship was started. The INF Treaty, which was signed in 1987, eliminated all intermediate-range nuclear missiles off the planet. People in the Soviet Union had already been showing their dislikes toward the government thanks to glasnost, and had been demonstrating an end to the one-party system. And finally, in 1990, elections with non-party candidates were held. These elections would be for the Soviet republics that made up the Soviet Union. One of the main candidates for these elections in the Russian Republic was Boris Yeltsin, a former Communist Party member. People viewed him as a good guy.
You know, at that time, Yeltsin came, another leader, and he was very charming, very charismatic. He was like very strong person, and it felt like everything would change for better.
And due to this, he was elected president of the Russian Republic in 1991. Yeltsin started fighting control of the Soviet Union and wanted Russia to become free. However, the state of the Soviet Union was bad. Food and commercial goods were scarce, and fuel production was down, causing nations to start relying more on Gulf countries for their fuel. In response to what was happening, communist hardliners such as Gennady Yanev tried to stage a coup known as the August coup. Using the KGB, they attempted to detain Gorbachev and Yeltsin. However, the coup failed 3 days after. During the time, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Azerbaijan, and Kyrgyzstan all declared independence from the Soviet Union. And, on December 8th, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed the Belousov Accords, dissolving the Soviet Union. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, many countries had to grapple with the transition to democracy and a market economy, or in some cases, to a new dictatorship. The transition was tough, especially in Russia and Ukraine. Their economies were still in decline, and corruption was widespread in their governments. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union and then pulling out of the war in Afghanistan, groups such as the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS all rose to power in the Middle East. President H.W. Bush decided to take a more relaxed role in the transition, opting to let it play out, but he still sent money to support reform in Russia and signed the START treaties. However, during this period, many people weren't happy with Boris Yeltsin. He was corrupt, had caused the Chechen War, and led the Russian economy to collapse. So, in 1999, he resigned from office, and, in the elections of the same year, Vladimir Putin was elected president of Russia. A former KGB agent, he wished to see himself as the great leader to expand Russia. Under him, Russia started to grow economically and was regaining its place as a superpower. After his second term, the constitutional limit, he handed over power to Dmitry Medvedev and became prime minister under him. And, in 2012, he was re-elected in what many claim was a fraudulent election. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 had far-reaching and lasting consequences in the world, with contemporary events such as the conflict in Ukraine serving as vivid reminders of its lasting impact. Many new countries of the former Eastern Bloc and Soviet Union started to join the EU and NATO. With the power vacuum that had formed, new countries have started to take their place in the New World Order. Under the leadership of Putin, Russia has invaded two sovereign nations, Georgia and Ukraine. Meanwhile, trade between the former nations of the Soviet Union and the US has grown, causing economies to boom and new relationships to form. However, tensions between the superpowers are rising, and with that, the world has found itself in another Cold War scenario.